Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you at the Construction News Summit. My name is Tom Thackray. I lead the CBI's policy work on infrastructure and energy, and that also includes how business can play a role in combating climate change. And my presentation today is about technology transformation and productivity improvement in the construction sector. There's four main areas I'm going to cover. Firstly, looking at how the UK industry performs relative to other sectors in the UK and the construction industry in other countries. Secondly, looking at how the current political and economic situation means that the time is now right to accelerate the transformation that's needed. Thirdly, looking at how some of the changes that we've seen recently during the pandemic might lead to changes in demand patterns and how the construction industry might need to respond to that. And then finally, looking at what needs to change in terms of policy and in terms of company behaviour to make most of the opportunities that are presenting themselves. But before I get into some of that, I think it's just useful just to establish why the CBI has got an interest in the success of the construction sector. And some of this might be fairly self-evident. It's an important sector to our economy in its own right. It adds over £120 billion in gross value add each year, employs more than 3 million people across the entire country. It's really a ubiquitous sector, can play a role in the levelling up agenda. And construction pays higher wages in each earning decile compared with the economy average too. So it's an important source of prosperity and life chances. But from a CBI perspective, which is obviously a cross-business organisation, it's really important to the wider economy. It plays that enabling role, which greases the wheels of the economy, enables businesses to succeed. So that for every £1 spent on construction activity, that creates an additional £2.92 of additional economic value. It's also often interesting to politicians because it has that counter-cyclical impact. So it can be a good stimulus when you're going through a downturn, and obviously has been the focus of politicians recently as a result of that. So I can say with absolute confidence that there's not one of the 190,000 businesses that the CBI represents that does not rely on construction to one degree or another. So that's why the CBI cares about it. It keeps the wheels of the economy moving, whether it's the delivery of infrastructure, housing, homes, hospitals, anything like that. So the CBI works hard along with other bodies representing the sector to ensure that we have a dynamic and successful construction industry. And sometimes the nature of our support is cross-cutting. So we've worked really hard with the government on things like the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, providing access to business interruption loans, which impacts and benefits the construction sector as much as anyone else. But sometimes our work is more sector specific, campaigning, for example, for extended opening hours during the pandemic, the extension of planning permissions, the extension of Help to Buy scheme, for example. Those are areas where we've campaigned and had some success in recent times. So the construction sector matters to UK industry, and for that reason we have a huge interest in its success. One of the areas that it seems that the construction sector there needs to be an improvement in how it's performing is in the productivity of the sector and its ability to transform using technology. And just to exemplify some of these points, I'm just going to take us through how it compares with other sectors in productivity growth and with other economies. And it's clear, I think, from what we've learned during the pandemic that there are limitations with simply adding manpower if you want to create more output. Industry has needed to find ways to become more efficient and has actually in recent months done that to get more output from less input. So, as is well documented and well understood, the UK has a long-established productivity problem, worse than the United States, France, Germany, Australia, Japan. I could list several more countries, but it's been persistent as well. That's been the case for over 25 years. And what's more is that the construction sector has particularly low levels of productivity growth. You can see that the chart on the left shows that productivity growth between 1995 and 2017 has shown that the construction sector is among the slowest growing, behind manufacturing, logistics, and even agriculture. What's more, and what other data tells us, is that where the sector has invested in technology, that has contributed virtually zero growth in GVA compared with other sectors. Added to that, again, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side of the slide there, what that shows is that productivity per worker in the construction sector also seems to lag behind similar sectors in other parts of the world, such as the US, Canada, Australia, France, and Germany. So I'm not painting an incredibly positive picture at the moment. In a country where productivity growth isn't great, construction sector seems to be among the worst. Investment in technology, we know, can be a key driver of that growth in productivity, but where it has been spent in the construction sector, it doesn't seem to have had as much an impact as similar sectors, either in other countries or different sectors in the UK. And we are behind those competitor firms in other countries as well. So something needs to change. And there are some clear drivers of that change right now. And the UK government has obviously put a lot of emphasis on the need to build as a route out of the crisis. Boris Johnson promised Rooseveltian levels of public investment to achieve this aim. And while I'm not refuting that claim, I think the fiscal conditions to enable that public investment in the built environment look more and more challenging as we look at the state of the public finances coming out of the crisis. What this chart shows is that public borrowing in the current financial year has rocketed as government has taken some extraordinary measures to support the economy. And let me just add that they are extraordinarily useful and necessary measures as well, keeping people in jobs, particularly the job retention scheme. Public borrowing could be as high as £350 billion in 2020, 2021. And this means that on the public investment side of things, there's not likely to be huge amounts of fiscal space for further expansion. Indeed, there might be calls for some consolidation of that kind of investment. I'll refer to it later on in one of the slides that I've got, but in the private sector too, I think there's reason to believe that investment intentions are likely to be constrained for a while as well. But while there's going to be pressures both on the public client side and on the private client side, there's still going to be a requirement to upgrade the built environment if we're not going to enter into a longer period of stagnated growth. So the question may therefore be, how do we deliver those upgrades more efficiently to achieve those outcomes, but with less input? The second big driver that I was going to draw attention to is just in the need to cut greenhouse gas emissions and meet our net zero target. As we heard from the Prime Minister last week, the government has put decarbonisation at the heart of its economic recovery agenda. This is something, actually, talking to businesses across sectors, that they are in favour of. We were proud backers of the net zero target when it was established last year. And I think it's because businesses are hearing from their investors and from their customers that they need to be more sustainable. More and more businesses are being impacted by extreme weather events, impacted directly by things like flooding. And more positively, businesses are looking at the niches that they can create and the markets that they can exploit by being first movers in technology to do with cutting emissions. So the construction industry, like other sectors, has the opportunity to benefit from some of those things. I think it's fair to say that the CBI has supported, therefore, this concept of a green recovery and tends to come forwards with sets of policies that will create the conditions to enable the achievement of it. But there should be no understating the scale of the challenge that achieving net zero emissions by the middle of this century would be. The chart on the left here shows that in the last decade, our relative success in cutting emissions has been largely due to the success of the power sector in cutting emissions, and in particular taking coal off the grid. And all other sectors have remained pretty flat in terms of cutting emissions over that time frame. So if we look at buildings, for example, which is highlighted in the right-hand chart there, the reduction in emissions has been relatively modest, particularly when compared with the power sector. So what are the implications of this? Well, it's likely that we will see new standards and regulation coming forward. We already saw a bit of that last week. And this is going to need to drive innovation, either to reduce costs to remain competitive internationally, or to take advantage of those market opportunities that I talked about previously. There's likely to be a big drive towards retrofit, innovations in how the construction sector measures and reports its environmental impact. And clearly, there needs to be a move towards capturing embedded emissions as that comes to the fore and customers start to become more aware of their responsibilities here. It's fair to say that the scale and pace of this change is going to need to be rapid as well. 2050, although it seems like a long time away, is really not that far away. It's only a few investment cycles, depending on the industry in question. So there are good reasons to think that the time is now for the uplift in productivity that we've been waiting for some time in construction and the adoption of technology. And it's also worth noting that the prize is significant too. Work that the CBI undertook with Oxford Economics earlier this year showed that a 2% boost to productivity per year could see an additional £30 billion of economic value created every single year. And that 2% boost wouldn't be out of line with other sectors of the economy, or indeed the construction sector in other parts of the world. Sorry, just moving the slide to look at what's happening in the private sector now. And what are we hearing from our members that might have a bearing on construction's capacity? Well, firstly, as I mentioned earlier, the investment intentions are starting to rebound in the surveys that the CBI has undertaken recently, but this has come from a very low base. The pandemic and ongoing Brexit question marks have altered businesses' approach to discretionary spend. There's a fair amount of uncertainty still prevailing. And while we hope that there's a vaccine next year and the rollout of mass testing might help to unlock some of that pent-up demand, we have seen that the second wave of infections this autumn has meant that economists have revised their expectations on the recovery. Now we're looking at a W-shaped recovery rather than a V-shape, and we're not expecting the economy to reach pre-pandemic size until 2022. And it's worth noting that throughout this period, though, just as an aside, the construction sector has shown remarkable resilience. The vast majority of sites have remained open, and the development of site operating procedures has enabled that to happen safely. The sector has really stepped up in the construction of some key sites for dealing with the pandemic, notably the Nightingale hospitals. And I think it's fair to say that the sector has united in its voice to government, particularly through the Construction Leadership Council, and should be commended for doing that. Oh, I seem to have lost my bars here, but I will make them appear now. And as well as the economic situation and how that's altered things and how that might impact on the construction sector, I think it's fair to say that business operations are likely to change remarkably beyond the pandemic even, and that might have an impact on the type of clients that the construction sector might find in the private sector. The biggest change, and perhaps most obvious, is that we've seen a move towards flexible working during the pandemic, and that is likely to persist beyond the pandemic. So whereas business estimated that in 2019, around 79% of their staff worked entirely or mostly in an office or other workplace, in 2021, they expect that figure to be less than a third. Half of businesses expect that the majority of their staff will split their time evenly between the workplace and home. And that has implications for many factors of life and many parts of the economy. So companies are already thinking about different requirements that they'll need for office space. It will have an impact on people's choices when it comes to commuting and transport infrastructure. It will perhaps have a bearing on people's living choices. So might they be willing to live further away from the office if they're only commuting there 2 or 3 times a week? We're certainly hearing examples from house builders that they are looking to redesign sites to accommodate more garden and green space, as well as home offices with greater regularity. So construction will have its role to play in responding to these shifting patterns of demand. It's likely to have to show some agility in doing that, and will probably be going through similar changes itself. It certainly will have to show that it can compete as an employer as these labour market changes bear fruit in the years ahead. It's worth noting as well as that added to this shift in where people work and the working patterns, businesses have adopted more technology in the last 3 months than they had in 3 years prior to the pandemic. So the overall shift towards technology adoption has accelerated in the wider economy. So I think I've tried to set out a case of why the construction sector needs to look at technology adoption, the potential prizes that could be there if they are able to do them, to make those changes, and how recent changes in the economy and in society might mean that the time is right. But how is this all going to be achieved? And I think certainly there are some dynamics in the sector that have counted against it in making greater strides in technology adoption and productivity. And quite simply, without financial sustainability, there can be little hope of the necessary investment to bring about technological change. Earlier this year and before the pandemic hit, we worked with our members in the industry to set out a blueprint for the changes that we wanted to see. And some of the most important points were, firstly, getting clients in the public and private sectors to focus on whole life outcomes rather than racing to the bottom on cost. Ultimately, this is going to be really important to improve the sector's record on timeliness and adherence to budgets, as well as making sure that relationships aren't strained throughout projects and programs. Secondly, our members wanted much more use of a two-stage bidding processes in projects, enabling contractors to get much more involved early on in the process and deploy technology-led solutions throughout. Thirdly, and relatedly, a real focus on equitable sharing of risk between clients and suppliers and avoiding the piling on of risks to suppliers, enabling them to achieve more sustainable and crucially predictable margins that will allow them to invest with greater confidence. Fourthly, and particularly looking at the public sector, we've stressed the need for the implementation and enforcement of a new construction playbook, which promises to improve commercial behaviours and experiences in procurement. And there's a real opportunity to drive that throughout the public sector, including to local authorities. And then finally, support for the Construction Leadership Council and the Construction Innovation Hub on research and development, particularly to develop tools that will help to establish that whole life value and improve procurement processes. So a fair few areas to focus on to enable the sector to achieve financial sustainability, which will in turn see productivity improvements and investment in technology. So if those structural things are addressed, then there needs to be a focus on company level issues. And I think from our work with businesses across the economy, our innovation team have been able to pick out some things that they think matter at a company level based on the consultation with businesses across different sectors. And there's 4 things that they tend to stress. Firstly, the need to have that bird's eye view and that leadership from the centre. Often digital transformation is treated just as a simple IT project, when actually it requires company-wide change. Any successful change project requires a clear view about where the business is going and where it's coming from, and that requires leadership as well. So the board needs to share its digital vision with employees. It needs to commit to addressing the risks associated with the change program, share learnings across departments, keep in touch with people through things like digital newsletters, monthly town hall meetings, things like that can be really successful. Added to that, the leadership also has a role in making sure that digital transformation is resilient from the start. Unfortunately, cyber attacks are a reality for modern businesses. And one industry that has not suffered during the pandemic is the industry of cyber criminals. Senior leadership needs to take responsibility from day one and show that they are taking that issue seriously. I think while awareness is rising about the need to be cyber secure, action often lags behind this awareness, and it needs to be a priority. So that leadership is really important as the first stage. The second area we emphasize is just the importance of having people, and by people I mean employees, being advocates for the digital transformation program. Changes to company processes really live and die by two things, trust and communication. If it's done well, then employees will be the biggest advocates. If it's done badly, then they're likely to ignore the change and investment will be wasted. So things that matter tend to be around aligning the digital transformation with the company's purpose. And we know that people are much more motivated by purpose than perhaps they were in years gone by. Secondly, and importantly, continually learning and taking feedback from employees, particularly those on the front line responsible for operating the new technology. So they need to be empowered and skilled to come up with and implement solutions themselves rather than channeling those changes back to a central project team. So getting the best out of your people is a second important area. Thirdly, loving your silos. So often we talk about breaking down silos and digital transformation being one of the routes to being able to break down silos. But particularly in larger companies, silos are just a reality of business, and you should look to exploit them to best effect. So what it does create is the perfect opportunity to test technology in discrete business units, to iterate it and improve it before wider rollout. And companies that do that often have more successful digital transformation programs. And then finally, it's really important to build in automatic upgrades to digital technology to keep on top of innovations as they materialize. So this should be done by keeping that vision in mind that I spoke about earlier, by using KPIs and tracking performance against them, something that the construction sector does remarkably well, and scheduling in regular reviews to compare performance against the initial plan. So to conclude, the construction has done a remarkable job at keeping the wheels of the economy in motion, particularly during this pandemic. Even before this pandemic, though, it was due a transformation in technology and productivity improvement. And there are some signs that some of those structural and behavioural issues in the sector are starting to be addressed, and collaboration in the sector has certainly been more effective than it has been in the past. But the pandemic has shown that the economy is changing rapidly, and out of that rapid change can come opportunities. How we live, work, and socialise will change, and businesses themselves will change across the economy as well. And construction itself can grasp some of these opportunities. And for the good of the CBI members and the wider economy, I hope that it does just that. Thanks very much.